Music was soft, the laughter effortless, and the air inside the Palm Springs estate carried the unmistakable glow of Hollywood royalty. It was November of 1959, and inside Frank Sinatra's famous desert compound, the most powerful names in entertainment had gathered for one of the legendary private parties that only the Rat Pack could host. Crystal glasses clinked, tuxedos shimmered under the lights, and conversations floated through the marble foyer like pieces of a perfectly orchestrated performance. Yet in the middle of all that glamour, something happened that no one present would ever forget. A moment so brief it lasted less than a quarter of a second, but powerful enough to shatter the confidence of one of Hollywood's most celebrated gunfighters. Standing near the center of the room that night was Glenn Ford, the man audiences across America had recently come to know as the fastest gun alive, thanks to his hit Western film, The Fastest Gun Alive. Ford wasn't just an actor who pretended to draw quickly for the camera. He had trained seriously for the role, spending months studying real quick draw techniques, learning the mechanics of speed, and practicing until his draw time was genuinely impressive, even by professional standards. The dedication had paid off. Directors admired him, gun enthusiasts respected him, and Ford himself had started to believe that he wasn't simply portraying a legendary gunfighter, he might actually be one. The conversation that sparked everything began casually, the way most unforgettable moments do. Someone had mentioned the difficulty of making gunfights look convincing in Western movies. Ford immediately stepped forward, eager to explain the difference between movie tricks and real skill. With the confidence of someone who had practiced relentlessly, he began describing the science behind fast drawing: balance, timing, trigger control, and the subtle biomechanics that separated real speed from theatrical gestures. The guests listened closely, directors leaned in, actors nodded with curiosity. Ford demonstrated his stance, explaining that most actors moved far too slowly because they relied on dramatic motions rather than efficiency. Real quick draw, he explained, came down to eliminating every unnecessary movement. Either you could draw in less than half a second, or you were just pretending. Across the room, leaning comfortably against a polished column, another man listened quietly while sipping a martini. That man was Dean Martin. Martin had the relaxed charm that made people underestimate him. His tuxedo looked perfectly tailored, but slightly casual at the same time. His posture was loose, almost lazy. If someone had asked the guests to guess who in the room might secretly possess extraordinary gunfighting skills, Martin would likely have been near the bottom of the list. Ford didn't notice him at first. He was too busy explaining the subtleties of speed to an audience that seemed fascinated by every word. Authentic quick draw isn't about showmanship, Ford said confidently. It's about mechanics. You either understand the science, or you don't. Then a voice drifted across the room. That sounds pretty remarkable. It was Martin. Ford turned and smiled politely. The tone in his voice carried a friendly but unmistakable sense of superiority. Quick draw probably doesn't come up too often in your line of work, Dean. Martin shrugged lightly. I've done a little shooting over the years. Ford nodded the way a teacher nods when a student says something mildly interesting. Well, if you ever want a few pointers, I'd be happy to help. A few guests chuckled softly. They knew Ford's reputation, and no one expected a singer known for smooth crooning and cocktail humor to challenge a trained quick-draw performer. But Martin didn't seem offended. Instead, he simply set his martini down on a nearby table and walked toward Ford. You know, he said casually, Frank's got a shooting range on the property. Maybe we could do a friendly comparison. Heads turned instantly, conversations stopped. The idea spread through the party like electricity. Within minutes, a crowd of tuxedo-clad celebrities followed the two men outside toward the private range behind Sinatra's estate. The range was well equipped: targets, lighting, even timing equipment Sinatra occasionally used to entertain guests. Under the warm desert night, the atmosphere felt less like a party and more like a private sporting event. Ford prepared carefully. He checked his holster, adjusted his stance, and demonstrated the technique he had practiced for months. Every motion carried the precision of someone who took the skill very seriously. Martin, meanwhile, stood calmly nearby. His tuxedo jacket remained unbuttoned. One hand rested casually near his holster. The other held his martini again. He looked like a man watching a show rather than preparing to perform in one. Ford finally glanced over. Aren't you going to get ready? Martin tilted his head slightly. I think I'm ready. The crowd exchanged amused looks. Some assumed Martin was joking. Others suspected he was about to embarrass himself in front of Hollywood's most elite audience. Frank Sinatra stepped forward to call the command. Ready? Ford dropped into his trained stance instantly, every muscle prepared for explosive motion. Martin stood relaxed, his drink still steady in his left hand. Draw. Ford moved with impressive speed, his hand shot toward the holster with the precision he had practiced countless times. But before his revolver was even halfway out, Martin had already drawn. The motion was so fast that several people thought they had blinked and missed it. One moment his hand was resting casually near his side, the next his gun was already up and aimed. The martini in his other hand hadn't moved. Ford froze mid-draw, staring in disbelief. Silence fell across the range. Sinatra looked down at the timer. 0.2 of a second, someone whispered. Ford slowly lowered his weapon. That's not possible. Martin calmly holstered his gun and took another sip of his drink. Practice, he said simply. Ford shook his head. You can't draw that fast wearing a tuxedo and holding a drink. Martin glanced down at his glass as if he had forgotten it was there. Well, it's what I happened to be doing. Ford demanded another demonstration. Martin agreed. The second draw was even faster. This time the timer stopped at 0.19 seconds. The crowd erupted in stunned laughter and disbelief. Some guests insisted they hadn't even seen the motion at all. Ford tried again and again to match it. Each time his draw remained impressive, professional, and fast. But it wasn't even close. After several attempts, Ford finally lowered his weapon and looked at Martin with a completely different expression than he'd worn earlier that evening. You're not even trying, he said. Martin shrugged. Not particularly. Ford stared at him. So what happens if you actually try? Martin thought about the question for a moment. I suppose we'd find out. Something in Ford's posture changed then. The confidence that had filled the foyer earlier was gone. In its place was curiosity and humility. I think I've been making some assumptions, he admitted quietly. About what? Martin asked. About who really knows what they're doing. Martin smiled gently. Different people practice different ways. The rest of the evening slowly drifted back into party mode. Music returned, drinks were poured, and conversations resumed. But for those who had witnessed the moment, the atmosphere had subtly shifted. Before leaving the range, Ford approached Martin one last time. Would you teach me some of what you know? The request was sincere. Martin nodded. I'd be happy to. The story was never reported in magazines or newspapers. It lived quietly among Hollywood insiders, passed from one storyteller to another. Years later, whenever someone asked Ford about the most impressive display of skill he had ever seen, he gave the same answer. Dean Martin, he would say, at Frank's party, 19/100ths of a second, while holding a martini. And the lesson from that night became something deeper than a story about speed. It was a reminder that true mastery often hides behind effortless calm, and that the most dangerous people in any room are usually the ones who never feel the need to prove it. The story didn't end when the party returned to laughter and music. In the days that followed, Glenn Ford couldn't shake the memory of that moment at Frank Sinatra's Palm Springs estate. For years he had believed mastery meant constant practice, perfect conditions, and visible effort. Yet what he had witnessed from Dean Martin challenged that belief completely. Martin had drawn faster than anyone Ford had ever seen, while standing relaxed, dressed for a cocktail party, and holding a martini like the entire moment was nothing more than casual entertainment. When Ford later returned to film westerns, including roles inspired by his work on The Fastest Gun Alive, something in his approach had changed. The confidence remained, but the arrogance was gone. He now understood a deeper truth about skill. The greatest performers rarely advertise their power. Sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one capable of the most extraordinary things.